She was 54 years old and she had exactly $300 left in the world. Not in savings, not set aside. That was everything. The full sum of what remained after 29 years of marriage, a settlement that her lawyer called fair under the circumstances, and a drive from Thunder Bay to a town called Millhaven Crossing that she had not visited since she was 12 years old. Her name was Fiona Abernathy. And the only reason she still had a place to sleep was that her late aunt had left her a property in the Quebec Eastern Townships. A small stone post office that had stopped operating in 1981, sitting on a gravel road outside a village of 290 people, listed on the municipal rolls as a heritage structure nobody had touched in 4 decades. She had not planned to go there. She had not planned anything. She had simply driven. Before we get into what Fiona found inside that building, and what she found is going to stay with you, if stories like this matter to you, go ahead and subscribe to Epic Stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories reach. Fiona Marguerite Abernathy had been born in 1969 in Thunder Bay, Ontario, the second daughter of a Finnish-Canadian mother who taught woodworking at a vocational college, and a father who drove long-haul freight across the Trans-Canada. She grew up in a house that smelled of sawdust and strong coffee, where supper was always at 6 and bedtime was always argued over, and the winters lasted so long that spring felt like a rumor. Every second summer of her childhood, her parents drove her east to visit her mother's older sister, Aunt Tuliki, who lived in the eastern townships of Quebec, in a village called Millhaven Crossing, population then about 400. Tuliki was a tall, quiet woman who kept bees and spoke Finnish with the vowels of someone who had never quite left the old country. She lived alone in a farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road, and her property backed onto a meadow that ended at a tree line of sugar maples and white spruce. Fiona loved those summers more than she could explain to anyone who had not been there. She loved the way the mornings came in so slowly, the way her aunt moved without hurrying, the way every task had its proper season. Her aunt had a habit of stopping mid-sentence to listen to something Fiona could not hear, and then nodding, as if the silence had told her something useful. Tuliki died in 2019, 2 years before Fiona's marriage ended. She left the farmhouse to a nephew in Helsinki and left Fiona, her favorite, though she never said so directly, the small stone post office building on Rue des Érables, which Tuliki had purchased at a municipal auction in 1994 for the price of back taxes, meaning she had paid $800 for it, meaning she had held it for 25 years and done almost nothing with it, except keep the roof sound and pay the property tax every spring. Fiona had never once visited the building. She had driven past it as a child and asked what it was, and her aunt had said, "That's the old post office. They closed it a long time ago," and that had been the end of it. When the inheritance papers came in 2019, Fiona had tucked them in a folder in the bottom drawer of her desk in Thunder Bay and thought, "I will deal with that later." She was in the middle of a marriage. She was working as an administrative coordinator for a regional school board. She believed, time. She did not have time. Or rather, time had her. Gregory Abernathy told her about the separation on a Saturday morning in January. They were in the kitchen. She was making oatmeal. He was standing at the counter with his coat already on, as if he had somewhere to be, and she realized, as he spoke, that he had somewhere to be. He had had somewhere to be for a while. Her name was Danielle. She was 37. She worked with Gregory at the engineering firm where he had become over the past decade, quietly important. They had met, he said, at a conference in Halifax. He was sorry. He had tried to find another way. There was not another way. He was already, it turned out, half gone. Fiona turned off the burner. She set the spoon down. She looked at the window above the sink at the snow coming down outside, and she thought, "I have been watching snow come down in this kitchen for 29 years, she said very quietly. "Then go," he went. The settlement took 11 months. The house in Thunder Bay had been in both their names, which was the one thing that worked in her favor. But 29 years of marriage had produced, somehow, very little in the way of individual financial footing. She had taken a leave of absence from the school board when Gregory's career required them to move to Thunder Bay's West End. And then the leave had stretched and the job had been restructured, and Fiona had shifted into part-time consulting work that paid less than it should have and kept her in a permanent state of, "We'll figure it out later." Later had not come. The settlement was honest and it was small. She left the lawyer's office in November with $300 in her account. The right, to keep her books and her aunt's old spinning wheel, and a piece of paper that told her she now fully owned a stone post office in Quebec that she hadn't been inside in 40 years. She sat in her car for a long time. Then she thought about Millhaven Crossing. She drove east the following week. It was 930 kilometers. She stopped twice. Once for gas near Sudbury, once for coffee just past the Ontario-Quebec border. And she did not turn on the radio because she needed the silence the way she sometimes needed sleep. The eastern townships in late November have a particular quality of light. The hills roll slow and long, the maple groves stand bare and pewter-colored against a low white sky, and the roads through the smaller villages are quiet in a way that is not emptiness but rather settledness, the feeling of a place that has been where it is for a long time and has no plans to move. Fiona drove through Millhaven Crossing's Main Street just after noon. The pharmacy was still there. The Caisse Populaires was still there, although it had a new sign. The bakery that had been Aubyn's was now something called Fournil du Coin. The post office, the real current Canada Post outlet, had moved into a corner of the hardware store sometime in the past 20 years. Nobody had needed the stone building on Rue des Érables for a long time. She found it at the end of the road, set back from the gravel, half hidden behind a stand of old lilac bushes that had gone unpruned for decades and now spread in a thick gray tangle across the front. The building was small, the size of a large living room. The walls were local fieldstone, dark mortared, solid. The roof was tin, rusted to a reddish brown. The door was painted green once, then gray, and the paint had lifted in long curling strips. Above the door, still bolted into the stone, hung a wooden sign so weathered she had to step close to read it. Bureau de Poste de Millhaven Crossing. Établi 1922. Post Office of Millhaven Crossing. Established 1922. Fiona stood in the gray November light with her hands in her coat pockets and felt something she did not have a name for. It was not nostalgia. It was something more like a compass needle finding north. She had a key that her aunt's estate lawyer had mailed her in a small padded envelope, along with a note that said simply, "She kept it going for you." Fiona had not known what that meant when she read it. She was beginning to understand now. The lock was stiff from the cold, but it turned. The door opened inward with a sound like something exhaling. Inside, the air was cold and still and smelled of old paper and something sweet she could not place at first. Cedar, she realized. Someone had laid cedar planks along one wall a long time ago. The floor was wide pine boards, worn smooth and dark with age. There was a wooden service counter running the length of the room, behind which post office boxes still lined the wall. 112 small brass-doored compartments, each numbered, most still holding the keys in their locks. The afternoon light came in through two small windows and fell in pale rectangles across the floor. On the counter, someone had left a folded piece of paper. Fiona picked it up. It was in her aunt's handwriting and dated 3 weeks before Tuliki died. "Fiona, chair, look in the back room, the wooden cabinet on the left. I have been meaning to tell you for years, take your time." T. The back room was barely a room at all. It was what had been the postmaster's office, no bigger than a closet. A small desk, a metal stool, a low window overlooking the meadow behind. And on the left wall, a wooden cabinet, tall, old, made of ash, with 2 doors and a simple latch. Fiona, inside, stacked on 4 shelves with the precision of someone who took this very seriously, were bundles of letters, not loose letters. Each bundle was tied with kitchen twine, labeled in a clear, careful hand with a name and a year range. Gagnon family, 1940 to 1952. Thibodeau, Yves, 1943-1945. Beauchamp, 1944-1946. Marchetti family, 1953 to 1968. Bundle after bundle after bundle. Dozens of them. Fiona counted 41 separate bundles, each one carefully preserved. The paper still pale beneath the protective wrapping of wax cloth. She stood very still. These were not official postal records. These were personal letters. Someone had sorted them, saved them, bundled and labeled them. And they had been sitting in this cabinet for decades, waiting. She took down the first bundle. Thibodeau, Yves, 1943-1945. She untied the twine and opened the first letter. The handwriting was that of a young man writing quickly, as young men do when they are writing from somewhere they do not entirely want to be. November 14, 1943. Ma chère Mama, we are in England still. The food is not like yours. Nothing here is like yours. Tell Papa I am well. Tell little Suzanne I got her drawing of the cat. I put it on the wall above my bunk and the fellows all asked who drew it. I said my sister who is 9 and they said she should be a painter. I think so too. Keep the stove going. I will be home before the ice. Eve. He was not home before the ice. The bundle contained 42 letters from Eve Thibodeau, written between November 1943 and February 1945. The last one was dated February 28, 1945, from somewhere in Belgium. There was no letter after that. Fiona sat on the metal stool in the back room and read until she could not see the page anymore. Not because the light had gone, though it had. Because she was crying. She slept badly that night, in the one room she had rented above the hardware store, and in the morning she went back. It took her a week to understand what she was looking at, and it took someone from the village to explain where it had come from. His name was Fernand Aubin. He was 78 years old, and he had grown up in Millhaven Crossing, and his mother had been the postmistress here for 31 years. He found Fiona on the third day, having heard from 2 different neighbors that someone was cleaning up the old post office. And he walked over with a paper bag of galettes from the new bakery and a look on his face that she would later describe as a man trying not to cry in advance. "You found Madeleine's cabinet," he said. She looked at him. "Madeleine? Madeleine, Aubin. My mother." He set the galettes down on the counter and looked at the open cabinet doors. "I haven't seen inside that in, Lord, 40 years maybe." Madeleine Aubin had been postmistress of the Millhaven Crossing Bureau de Poste from 1939 to 1971, 32 years. She had come to the job at 23, fresh from commercial school in Sherbrooke, hired to replace the retiring postmaster because she was the only candidate who could both handle the bilingual correspondence and operate the Underwood typewriter without complaint. She had been born in the village. She had grown up knowing every family on every road within 30 kilometers. She had, Fernand said, the kind of memory that people used to call a gift and later called a burden. She knew every person who had a box in this office, Fernand said, and she took it seriously. When letters came for men overseas, soldiers and their families moved or changed address or just stopped coming in, she didn't forward the letters to the dead letter office. She kept them. She said they deserved better than that. She said someday those families would want to know what their boys had written. Fiona looked at the cabinet. 41 bundles. Was she right? Fiona asked. Fernand was quiet for a moment. She never found out, he said. She died in 87. She'd been retired 16 years by then. She never told anyone what was in that cabinet. I knew she had it, but I don't know why I never opened it. He shook his head. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Fiona spent the following week reading every bundle. She kept a notebook. She wrote down names, dates, where the letters had come from. England, France, Belgium, Holland, Korea, later Vietnam. Letters from young men to their mothers. Letters from daughters who had gone to Montreal for work and were sending money home and apologizing for not visiting. Letters from a physician in Quebec City to his father who was losing his sight and couldn't read them anymore, so the letters had never been picked up. Letters from someone named Région Marchetti, who had moved to Vancouver in 1961 and written every month for 7 years to a sister who had already left the village, the letters sitting uncollected in box number 44 for half a century. If you've stayed with us this far, now is a great time to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the part of this story that made us stop and sit with it for a long time. Fiona was in her 3rd week in Millhaven Crossing when she found the second layer. She had been cleaning the post office boxes, wiping decades of dust from the brass doors, finding old keys stuck in locks, when she noticed that box number 1, the first one top left, in the corner, had no key in the lock. She tried every spare key she had found in the drawer under the counter. None of them fit. She finally borrowed a small set of picks from the hardware store owner, a patient man named Gerard, who asked no questions and lent tools without expectation of explanation. The lock gave on the second afternoon of trying. Inside box number 1 was a tin, the kind that had once held hard candies. She pried it open. Inside the tin were 3 things: a brass button from what appeared to be a postal uniform, very old, a small photograph, black and white, of a woman standing behind the service counter of this very post office, smiling at whoever was taking the picture, wearing a postal apron, dark hair pinned back, late 30s perhaps. Some expression that was both tired and entirely at ease. And a handwritten note, folded twice. The note read, "To whoever takes care of this place after me. The cabinet in the back room holds letters that belong to families in this village and this valley. They were never delivered or never collected, but they are not lost. They are waiting. These people deserve to know what was said to them. Please find a way to give the letters home." Madeleine Aubin had known. She had known that someone would come. She had left instructions 40 years ago in a tin inside a locked box for a woman she would never meet. Fiona sat on the floor of the post office with the note in her hands and cried for a long time. Not for herself, for Madeline, who had spent 32 years holding the words of an entire community together, who had kept those letters safe for decades past her retirement, who had trusted, with no evidence that she was right to trust, that someone would eventually come and finish what she had started. Fiona thought about her own 29 years, about the way she had waited for things to be hers, about the leave that became a life, the later that never came, the years of accommodation and adjustment, and telling herself there was still time. She was 54 years old with $3 $100 in a stone building and 41 bundles of letters that needed to go home. She called Fernand that evening. "I need your help," she said. "I need to find the families." Fernand was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said, "I thought you might say something like that." He came the next morning with a woman named Odette Cloutier-Boudrias, who was 91 years old and had been born in Millhaven Crossing, and had, Fernand said, the kind of memory my mother had, only Odette is still here to use it. Odette came in a wool coat the color of pine needles and sat at the counter, and Fiona laid out the bundles in front of her one by one. Odette went through every one of them. She knew the names, she knew the families, she knew which ones had stayed in the valley and which had scattered to Montreal and Toronto and further west. She remembered Yves Thibodeau. He didn't come back from Belgium. His mother Eugenie never spoke of it, but you could see it in her. She carried it her whole life. There are grandchildren. Thibodeau, there are grandchildren in Granby now. And she remembered the Marchetti family, and she remembered the physician in Quebec City whose name was Renaud Berthelot, and whose son, she believed, was a pharmacist in Drummondville. It took Fiona and Fernand 3 months to trace the families. Fiona was living by then in the back room of the post office, which she had cleaned out and made habitable with a camp cot, a plug-in kettle, and a propane heater. She had no money for a proper rental. She had applied for a contract position doing records management for the municipality of the next township, and they had said yes, which gave her $900 a month and a reason to be at a desk by 8 in the morning, which turned out to matter more than the money. She wrote 41 letters of her own, one to each family she and Fernand and Odette had been able to locate. She wrote them by hand, in both English and French, explaining who she was and what she had found and what she would like to do. She was careful. She was not sure how people would respond to a stranger telling them she had been keeping their grandmother's letters in a cabinet for decades. She should not have worried. The first letter came back from a woman in Granby named Sylvie Thibodeau Fortin. She was 77 years old, and she was Yves Thibodeau's niece, the daughter of little Suzanne who had drawn the cat. Madame Abernathy. I cannot tell you what this means to me. My mother talked about her brother her entire life. She kept a photograph of him in uniform on her dresser until she died. She always said she wished she knew what he had been thinking in those last months, whether he was frightened, whether he knew how much she loved him. And now you are telling me there are letters. I am coming. Tell me when, and I will come. She drove from Granby in a January snowstorm, 4 hours each way, and she sat at the counter of the old post office with her coat still on, and Fiona handed her the bundle, and Sylvie Thibodeau Fortin held those letters for a long time before she could open them. When she did, she read the first one. "Tell little Suzanne I got her drawing of the cat," and put her hand over her mouth and made a sound Fiona was not sure she was supposed to hear. She heard it anyway, and she understood that this was exactly the sound of something being found after a very long absence. By March, 16 families had come to Millhaven Crossing to collect their letters. They came from Montreal, from Ottawa, from Chicoutimi, from Halifax, from Vancouver. They ranged in age from 62 to 89. Some of them had known about the letters. Most had not. A woman named Paulette Berthelot drove down from Drummondville with her father, who was 93 and almost entirely deaf, and who sat at the counter with the stack of letters his own father had sent him from Quebec City in 1962 and 1963. Letters about his fading eyesight, about the garden, about missing Sunday dinners, and the old man read every one of them without saying a word. And when he was done, he folded them carefully and put them in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and nodded at Fiona as if they had made an agreement. Fiona did not know what the agreement was exactly, but she felt it too. It was a developer who brought her to the crisis point. Her name was Sylvain Tremblay-Wallet, and she represented a group called Sommet Patrimoine Quebec, which was developing what she called heritage integrated boutique hospitality in several eastern townships villages. She drove to Millhaven Crossing in a white Volvo in early April, wearing a coat that had not been bought within 200 kilometers of here, and she found Fiona raking dead leaves out of the lilac bushes in front of the post office. "Madame Abernathy? Sylvain Tremblay-Willet. Sommet Patrimoine. I've been trying to reach you." She had in fact sent 2 emails that Fiona had not yet figured out how to respond to. "I'll be direct. This building has good bones and a beautiful story. Our firm is developing a boutique in a few kilometers from here. You may have seen the signage near the Chemin du Lac turnoff, and we're looking for a heritage annex, something with authentic provenance. We'd like to offer you $210,000 for the property. Clean title, 30-day close." Fiona set down the rake. She looked at Sylvain Tremblay-Willet, who had the patient professional expression of someone who had made offers like this before and was confident in the outcome. "There are 41 families," Fiona said, "who still need their letters." Sylvain nodded. "I understand it's been a meaningful project. The letters could be archived. The regional library in Sherbrooke has excellent conservation facilities. They'd be well cared for. This isn't about erasing history. It's about giving the building a sustainable future." "Madeleine Aubin kept this building running for 32 years, Fiona said. "She kept letters for families whose sons didn't come home. She put a note in a tin and locked it in a box and trusted that someone would come along and finish what she started." She paused. "I'm in the middle of finishing it. $210,000 is a considerable sum." "I know what it is," Fiona said. She did. She knew exactly what it was. She thought about her $100, which was now $1,740. She thought about her camp cot and her propane heater. She thought about being 54 years old with no pension and no clear path forward and a contract job that paid $900 a month. She said, "I'll think about it. You'll have my answer in a week." That week was the hardest she had spent since January of the separation. She thought about it every night. She lay on the camp cot in the back room and listened to the building settle in the cold, the particular sound of old stone and old wood adjusting to the temperature, and she thought, what would Madeleine have wanted? Would she have wanted this to continue, or would she have understood? On the 5th night, Fiona went back to the cabinet. There was one bundle she had not yet opened, not because she had forgotten it, because she had felt from the first day that it was the last one to open. It was at the back of the bottom shelf, wrapped more carefully than the others, tied with red ribbon instead of twine. It was labeled simply, Pour plus tard, M.A. for later. Fiona untied the ribbon. Inside were not undelivered letters. Inside was a collection of notes, written in Madeleine's own hand on postal forms and notepaper and the backs of envelopes, describing what she called les petites choses, the small things, the things she had done for people without anyone knowing. Advancing postage for a widow who came to send a parcel to her son in Halifax and discovered she had come without enough money. Redirecting a letter that she knew, from 40 years of knowing these families, had been sent to the wrong address, a clerical error that Madeleine had recognized and corrected by hand without telling anyone. Writing, in 1944, a personal letter to the Thibodeau family from her own name, before the telegram came from Ottawa, because she had recognized from the silence in the bundle that Eves had stopped writing, and she thought the family should not be alone when they learned what that silence meant. "I do not know if this was my place," Madeleine had written, in a note dated sometime in the late 1960s, "but I was here and they were here and the building was here, and I thought, if not me, then who?" Fiona set the bundle down. She sat in the dark post office for a long time, in Madeleine's building, surrounded by Madeleine's work, holding a note written by a woman who had been dead for almost 40 years and who had just answered the question Fiona had been asking herself for a week. If not me, then who? She called Sylvain Tremblay-Willet the next morning. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'm not selling. Not now, not later. This building isn't mine in the way you'd need it to be." Sylvain was professional about it. She said she understood. She said the offer was open for 30 days if Fiona changed her mind, and she wished her well. Then she drove back to wherever she had come from in her white Volvo. Fiona stood in the front doorway of the post office and watched the car disappear down Rue des Érables. Then she got back to work. She applied to the Quebec Ministry of Culture for heritage designation. Fernand helped her with the application. It turned out he had spent 20 years on the village council and knew which forms went where. Odette Cloutier-Boudrias provided a 20-page written testimony about the cultural significance of the Bureau de Poste that the ministry later described, in their official review, as among the most thorough community documentation we have received in a decade. The designation came through in 8 months. Sylvain Tremblay-Willade's boutique inn was built on a different property, down near the lake. By June, 29 of the 41 families had received their letters. The remaining 12 required more searching. Families that had moved to Western Canada or the United States, names that had changed through marriage. One family whose last known address was in a town in Ontario that no longer existed. Fiona worked on them steadily, one by one, the way she was beginning to understand Madeleine had worked on everything. One letter at a time, one family at a time, without announcing herself. She was not doing it alone. Fernand came 3 days a week. Odette came when her knees allowed it and gave instructions from the counterstool when they didn't. A retired school teacher named Isabelle Fontaine-Grenier, who had heard about the project through the municipal newsletter, started coming on Friday afternoons to help with French translation. The hardware store owner, Gerard, replaced the front door lock and would not accept payment. The bakery started leaving a bag of galettes on the counter every Tuesday. Nobody made a formal arrangement. Nobody sent an invoice. It simply happened, the way things do in small places when people understand that a thing is worth doing. In September, Fiona received a letter from a woman in Winnipeg named Thérèse Langlois Audet, who was the grandniece of Régiane Marchetti, the woman who had written from Vancouver for 7 years to a sister who had already left. Thérèse had found out about the letters through a cousin in Montreal and had driven from Winnipeg, did not fly, to pick them up herself. She was 68 years old, and she arrived on a Saturday morning in a station wagon with a dog in the back seat. She spent 2 hours at the counter reading the letters her great-aunt had written, letters full of Vancouver rain and loneliness, and the particular grief of someone who has left home and found that the home they left has also, in its own way, left. And then she sat quietly for a while, and then she said to Fiona, "My great-aunt thought nobody was keeping these. She thought they were lost." "They weren't lost," Fiona said. "They were just waiting." Thérèse looked at her. "Did you know that when you started?" Fiona thought about it. "No," she said, "but I think Madeleine did." In October, Fiona held a small gathering in the post office. She invited everyone she had been in contact with, the families, Fernand, Odette, Isabelle, Gerard and his wife, the woman from the bakery, the municipal councillor who had helped with the heritage application. She expected perhaps 20 people. 43 came. They brought food. Tourtière, maple tarts, a pot of soup aux pois that someone left simmering on a camp stove in the corner. They stood in the stone room among the post office boxes and the cedar shelves and the long wooden counter, and they talked about Madeleine, about the letters, about the people who had sent them, and the people who had received them, and the years in between. Sylvie Thibodeau-Fortin came from Granby and told everyone about reading her Uncle Yves' letters. Old Paulette Berthelot's father, who was 93 and almost entirely deaf, came with his daughter and sat in the corner in a chair someone had carried in from the hardware store. And he watched the room with the expression of a man who had thought he had seen everything and was being shown he had not. And Fiona stood at the counter with a cup of tea and looked around at this room that had been empty for 40 years, that had been bequeathed to her as an afterthought by an aunt who had been holding it for her without either of them knowing that was what was happening. And she felt, for the first time since that January morning in the kitchen in Thunder Bay, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her Aunt Tuliki had said something to her once, during one of those long summers in the eastern townships, a sentence Fiona had filed away and not returned to in decades. She had been 12 or 13, sitting on the farmhouse steps in the August evening, and her aunt had been standing at the edge of the garden, looking at something in the meadow beyond. And she had said, without turning around, "Some things can only be finished by someone who wasn't there to start them." Fiona had not understood what she meant. She had thought it was the kind of thing adults said when they were thinking about something else. Now she understood. Now she thought about Madeleine Aubin, who had sorted and saved and labeled and waited and finally left a note in a tin, in a locked box for someone she would never meet, trusting that the someone would come. She thought about her Aunt Tuliki, who had bought a building for $800 and held it for 25 years, and left it to exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. She thought about all the letters that had waited in that cabinet, 40 years, 50 years, some of them longer, without being lost, without giving up, until the right person sat down and started reading. She thought about her own 29 years and what it had cost her to stay in the wrong place, and she thought about the year she had now spent in the right one. And she understood that both things were part of the same story, that the going wrongs is sometimes what teaches you how to go right. Fiona Marguerite Abernathy did not sell the post office. She registered it with the Quebec Heritage Program and applied for a small operational grant that came through the following spring. She kept her contract job with the municipality. She lived in the back room until she had saved enough to rent a small apartment 2 streets over, and then she rented it, and she kept a key to the post office on her keychain always. The way you keep something you intend to return to. By the following summer, she had reached all 41 families. Every bundle had gone home. The last family was a man from Calgary named Dennis Cormier, who was 71 and who received, from Fiona's hands, a stack of letters his grandmother had written to her sister in 1948 and 1949, describing life on a farm outside Millhaven Crossing, describing the particular blue of the sky in October over the hill, called Mont Saint-Odile, describing a way of life that Dennis Cormier had only ever heard fragments of and had spent most of his adult life wondering whether he had imagined. He had not imagined it. It was all there in his grandmother's handwriting, in 40-year-old ink that had not faded nearly as much as anyone might have expected. He held the letters for a long time. Then he said, "She wrote beautifully." "She did," Fiona said. He nodded slowly. "Somebody should have read these a long time ago." "Someone was taking care of them," Fiona said. "They just needed the right time." He looked at her and then at the room around him, the brass post office boxes, the cedar wall, the long-worn counter, the photograph of Madeleine Aubin that Fiona had framed and hung above the door. "Thank you," he said, "for being the right time." Fiona stood in the doorway of the post office on a July evening and watched Denny Cormier drive away down Rue des Érables, taking his grandmother's letters home to Calgary. The lilac bushes were in bloom. She had pruned them back in March, and they had come in thick and fragrant, the way they do when they've been left alone long enough to gather their strength. If this story stayed with you, we'd love for you to subscribe to Epic Stories and share this with someone who needs to hear it right now. And leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us about someone in your life who kept something safe for you, who held a door open that you didn't know was open, someone who prepared a place for you before you knew you needed it. Speak their name, whether they're still here or not, whether they know it or not. Speak it. Some things are only finished when somebody else picks them up, and that somebody, more often than you think, was always going to be you.